Hello and good afternoon to you all. It is with great pleasure that I introduce to you another talk of this Symposium on Diversity and Inclusion in STEM, Part 2, How do we move from theory to practice? Right now, I'm introducing to you the fantastic Gemma Puixeu Sala. We are extremely happy that she took her time to join us today. Gemma is a geneticist. She's doing her PhD at IST Austria, aimed to study the evolution of sex differences using a combination of mathematical and modeling and bioinformatics, and by looking at data across different species. Her main research focus is understanding the molecular mechanisms and evolutionary dynamics underlying the resolution of biological conflicts and interests between females and males. Gemma is also a feminist that is frustrated by how difficult it is, historically has been for both fields to constructively talk to one another. Gemma is committed to building bridges between them. Welcome, Gemma. I will now pass the ball to you. You may turn your microphone and video on and start sharing your screen.
Good.
I now can see your screen and I will be silent. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Okay, so let's get started. So I would like to, do you see a pointer? Yes, you do. Cool. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I don't know anymore what time it is. I'm Gemma, and I would like to start by thanking the organizers for inviting me and lending me the stage to altogether question the biological basis of sex and gender differences. Not by denying that there is a biological basis to sex and gender, but by acknowledging that these two concepts are very strongly influenced by cultural elements, and their contribution is super important to consider when trying to understand what they are and the implications that they have in our societies. Okay, so let's get started. I am a PhD student at IST Austria in Vienna, and this is what my everyday work looks like. As mentioned in the introduction, I'm looking at the evolution of sex differences at the very biological level by looking at data across many different species and doing some mathematical modeling. But don't worry, this is not what I'm going to talk about today. The reason why I'm here is because I realized that biology in general, and evolutionary biology and feminism have had historically a very hard time constructively talking to one another. What I mean by this is that biology-based arguments have been traditionally used to justify gender binarism and equality, something that frustrates me personally, politically, and also professionally. And this is partially why I'm here today. So I would like to use this opportunity to jointly question our current understanding of the biological basis of sex and gender by reflecting on the following. So we know that women and men are different, and the acknowledgement and proper study of these differences is super important for fields like, for example, biomedicine. But why are they different and how much? No, these are two critical questions that we have failed to address, and not because we haven't tried hard enough, but precisely because we have tried too hard. What I mean is that in science, as we will see, the interpretations of the results count at least as much as the results themselves. So it's never free from biases. And when we're talking about gender and sex, these biases are particularly strong because we live in a society that's very much based on gender and sex binarism. So basically, both consciously and unconsciously, research has been limited itself to reassuring this picture by providing biological natural explanation for gender binarism. Concretely, the traditional paradigm of the study of sex and gender differences has been based on the one hand, detecting differences between sexes and gender at different levels, from chromosomal composition, hormonal levels, to brain structure and behavior or attitudes. And on the other hand, automatically interpreting them as natural, biologically based, just because it makes sense many times without really proving the connection between the observations and the biologically based explanations that we're giving to them, and completely ignoring that there are extra biological elements that also contribute to generating and maintaining sex and gender differences. And basically this paradigm has led to the common understanding that there are two fundamentally different sexes or gender that basically perform two different roles in society. So with this in mind, what I would like you to do, or all together to do with the next few minutes that we have, is on the one hand, re-examine the classical yet current picture of biologically based justified biologically justified gender binarism, then question how we measure and, more importantly, how we interpret these sex and gender differences. Also argued that the distinction between nature and nurture, sex and gender, many times is not so clear because biology and culture interact with each other, as we will see in the next few slides. And this is why I'm talking about sex and gender altogether, although I will be very happy to talk about the bridges and borders between sex and gender with you, maybe in the discussion. And last, also argue that gender binarism is not there for biological reasons, but rather reinforced by both unconscious bias and conscious political agendas. Okay, good, let's get to it. So according to the traditional picture, sex and gender have two fundamentally different categories, which is well represented by the iconic idea that men are from Mars while women are from Venus. This vision is based on the belief that there are one-to-one linear relationships between the different steps of sex and gender expression. So according to this view, there would be some genes in the Y chromosome that linearly determine the development of testes in males, while their absence would linearly determine the development of ovaries in females. Then hormones produced by the gonads, or concretely testosterone, as what was considered the master factor of male masculinization, would linearly determine the development of the most complex elements of systemic sex, such as brain structure, leading to completely differentiated male and female brains, his being larger and heavier, and hers being more interconnected between hemispheres. And of course, two different sets of brains would lead to two completely differentiated sets of attitudes, behaviors, preferences, blah, blah, which conform gender. So voila, gender would be binary by nature, because it would be a linear consequence of the binary sex chromosomes. No? This is how we understood things for a very long time, and still now in many sectors. However, a new body of evidence has provided us with a revised picture, which suggests that the process of sex and gender expression is highly quantitative and multifactorial, leading to a continuum of possibilities for sex and gender expression. Why? How does this work? Well, to start with, gonadal sex can or cannot correspond to chromosomal sex. Then both types of gonads produce both typically male and typically female hormones, which only partially contribute to the development or expression of the systemic sex, such as brain structure. New evidence suggests that we cannot talk about male or female brains per se, because every individual brain is a combination of typically male and female features. And this mix only becomes more accentuated when we consider the expression of even more complex traits such as behaviors, attitudes, etc. So as you can see here, the process of sex and gender expression is highly complex and multifactorial, which is partially due to the fact that it is very highly sensitive to non-biological elements such as education and context, which, as we will see later, can get to influence even the biological variables such as hormonal levels or brain structure. So although there is there is for sure a biological component to sex and gender differences, gender binarism is not there for biological reasons. It's there because of cultural elements that enforce it. And of course, trying to distinguish what is biology from what is culture is a very difficult question, but we need to acknowledge the fact that there are non-biological elements that interact with biological dimensions in the process of sex and gender expression if we want to properly understand what it means to have one or gender or the other in the current societies. Okay, so in the next few minutes, I will go through a few examples where I would like to use that I would like to use to illustrate 2 points. On the one hand, again, that gender binarism is not natural, but socially or culturally constructed. And second, that we need a different methodology to study the origin and extent of sex and gender difference that takes into account the cultural and social components of sex and gender. Good, let's get started. So the first example has to do with the first steps of sex and gender expression with a very basic definition of biological sex. So when a baby is born, one of the first things that we do with them is assign them to one sex or the other. No, sometimes this is easy. They have long, large enough penis for it to be a boy, or a small enough clitoris for it to be a girl. But sometimes this is not so obvious, no? Maybe the person is born with ambiguous genitals, and this classification is not so easy. But as many of us know here, the classification happens anyway. This condition where the chromosomal, gonadal, and or hormonal sex do not exactly correspond is known as intersexuality, and it happens actually often enough. Recent estimates conclude that around 1.7% of the total population are intersex, which corresponds to the population of red-haired individuals, or to the Russian population. So it's really quite a lot. And the question is, why do we insist on classifying this 2%? No? Why do we insist on assigning a sex to everybody? Intersexuality per se does not compromise the health of the individuals. Then why do we pathologize them and correct them? Well, think about it. The first thing we want to know about the baby, even before they are born, is their sex, so we can know which clothes to buy them, and so we can also have an idea about the lifelong expectations in terms of job market or interpersonal relationships. So gender binarism is a fundamental part of our socio-political and economical systems. But the question that we're concerned about today is this gender binarism natural? Is it there for biological reasons? Well, probably not. First, because as we are seeing, there are individuals that do not fit this binary classification. So again, gender binarism is not there because of, but in spite of biology, which in this case would grant us with more diversity that we want to acknowledge. And second, sex and gender binarism is probably not natural because it's also not universal. There are many societies where there are third and fourth genders, and others like the Yoruba, for example, where not gender but age is what determines the socio-political status of the individuals. And another important point I want to make at this point of the presentation is that the reinforcement of sexual binarism not only denies the existence of particular individuals subject to this different reality, but also modifies the data that we use to understanding and assessing sex and gender. No? By forcing intersexuals to modify their bodies and alter their hormonal levels, because they don't fit our current standards, we're in turn modifying the standards, and with them, our understanding of what we think to be the most basic biological dimension of sex. Good. Let's move, now that we're talking about distributions, is a good moment to switch to hormones. So hormones are chemical messengers that are important for the development of our bodies. We have over 60 types of hormones, among which there are the sexual hormones, typically testosterone as the male hormone and estrogen and progesterone as the female hormones. Although they are known as male or female hormones, they are both expressed and important in both sexes. So for example, progesterone, which is famously known for preparing the female body for pregnancy, is also expressed in men, and it's super important for sperm synthesis. Estrogens, the female hormone per excellence, is synthesized from and into testosterone all the time in our bodies. And testosterone, which again was thought to be the main driver of male masculinization, is also present in females, and it's important for their reproduction, sexuality, and many other physiological functions. Then why, if they are expressed and important in both sexes, they are called male and female hormones, no? I would argue that this has to do with historical reasons associated with our fixation to look for the biological basis of sex and gender differences. As they were discovered at the turn of the 20th century, it was seen that increasing the levels of testosterone or estrogens would masculinize or feminize the individual. So these hormones were known as masculine or feminine, no? And it's actually true that they are expressed at different levels across sexes. For example, testosterone levels are 10-fold higher in males than in females, in human males and females. But these distributions are super wide, meaning that they overlap a lot. Actually, for the case of testosterone, there's a 10 to 15 overlap between the two distributions, which is really a lot. And also what the crucial question I would like us to reflect on here is, what do we mean that testosterone masculinizes individuals? What does it mean to masculinize? What does it mean to be masculine? No, having hair in our legs? Well, women do have hair in their legs, and if they don't, it's not because of their hormones, it's because there's gender norms forcing them to remove it. No, what else is masculine? Being confident. Well, women can be confident, and if they are not, it's again not because of their hormones, but because they are educated otherwise. Now that we are talking about confidence, it is true that confidence is higher confidence is associated with higher testosterone levels. But again, correlation is not causation, no? And it's not true that having higher confidence is the consequence of higher testosterone levels. And actually, it's many times the other way around, since recent research has demonstrated that personal experiences and attitudes influence hormonal levels. As an example, there was this study that put both men and women in a powerful position, and what they saw is that displaying power increased testosterone levels in women, but not in men, suggesting that power display is the natural state for men and not for women, and not because women cannot display power, but just because they don't, and the fact that they don't contributes to the gender gap in circulating testosterone levels. As another example, there was this other study that gave 2 different types of crying toy babies to men. The first type of toy baby was programmed to stop crying after giving a bit of care, and the second type was not. And what the study determined is that the men that couldn't make the baby stop crying, no, because it was just programmed not to stop crying, had increased testosterone levels in comparison with those that were able to calm the baby down. And actually, it has generally been determined that fathers have lower levels of testosterone in comparison with men that do not have children. So again, it's not that men cannot be good fathers because of their high levels of testosterone, but rather their high levels of testosterone are partially contributed by the fact that they many times participate little in parenting or care work. So long story short, there's a bidirectional crosstalk between hormones and gender, which basically challenges the picture that we had so far. And again, just like gender partially makes the amount of hair in our bodies, it also partially makes the hormonal levels that we have. And so by reducing the gender gap in gender norms, the hormonal gap will also in turn partially reduce. Good. Now let's switch to the last example where we will see that gender norms also partially contribute to generation and maintenance of differences in this time in terms of brain structure. To have a look at this, we can analyze how what I call the brain gender gap picture evolved a long time. So at the turn of the 20th century, scientists observed that the female brain is smaller and lighter than the male brain, something that was automatically interpreted as, oh yeah, men are more intelligent than women. It was actually later determined that there's a correlation between body size and brain size. So the fact that men have larger brains is associated with the fact that they are a bit larger than women in average and has nothing to do with brain function. Then with the improvement of techniques, it was possible to determine that on average, men have higher connectivity in the brain within hemispheres, while women have higher connectivity between hemispheres, something that can be seen in this picture, a picture that, by the way, was massively reproduced in the media together with the message that these observations would justify the fact that men are better at single tasking while women are better at multitasking, without, of course, determining scientifically the relationship between these observations and the differences in terms of attitudes between genders. But of course, it wasn't needed, it was just so obvious, right? And at this point, these type of results reinforced old religious or Victorian ideas associated with the complementarity of the sexes. So both sexes being different, but also equal, just designed to fulfill different functions within our societies. But again, more evidence suggests that while there are some characteristics that are more typically found in men and some in women in terms of brain structure, when we look at a particular brain, what we see is a combination of those. So we cannot talk about the two, so being two fundamentally different brains across the two sexes, as we can say, for example, for gonads, no? Okay, so now that we finally got an appropriate picture of this brain gender gap, we can ask why it took so long to get there, no? And I would argue that there are two main components leading to that. The first one is what some people call neurosexism, no? Scientists have spent a lot of time and effort trying to prove that there are fundamental psychological differences between women and men, and trying to justify those based on biological arguments. In this case, based on the fact that there are two fundamentally different brains across the sexes. And the second reason why it took so long to get to this picture is because of the academic system itself. Not only in this field, but in general, studies obtaining positive results are more easily published, which means that the many results that the many studies that conclude that no differences in brain structure between sexes were seen were not published. And this is not only wrong scientifically, but also it illegitimately contributes to reinforcing the idea that the brain structure in both sexes is fundamentally different, something that's wrong. Okay, so now that we have a more or less adequate picture of these sex differences in brain structure, we can start asking why there are those differences, no? And again, culture has a lot to say here. We know that brain development is highly plastic and occurs throughout an individual's life, responding to personal experiences and acquisition of knowledge, etc. So for example, we know that musicians have a more highly connected brain, or we know that, for example, taxi drivers have a larger than average hippocampus, which is the region of the brain involved in spatial memory. So if intense experience acquisition or learning experiences can shape the brain structure, can the experience of being a woman do the same? Well, the answer is probably yes, and there are actually quite a few scientists that suggest that almost all gender-based differences in brain structure could indeed be explained by gender stereotypes conditioning our development from very young ages. So again, that's another example of how culture interacts with biology in the expression of sex and gender. And just to very quickly finish, this is a bit of a summary, no? So as we saw, we've traditionally been very good at detecting differences between sexes and genders and interpreting them as, purely biologically driven. But as we also saw, there are many non-biological factors that interact with biology in the process of sex and gender expression. And this realization basically, on the one hand, questions, as I mentioned at the beginning, the canonical distinction between sex and gender, typically considered biological and cultural respectively, since both dimensions are in a constant conversation with one another. And on the other hand, we see that the main question that remains open is one that we thought that we had answered a long time ago. No, what is the role of biology in sex and gender differences? Well, as we see, biology is not everything. There are many other aspects that contribute to that. And until we acknowledge this and properly incorporate it into our research pipelines, we won't be able to properly understand the meaning and applications of sex and gender and the roles that they play in our societies. That was it. Thank you. I'll now be happy to take questions, and me podéis perguntar em espanhol, também em português, se vocês quiserem. Obrigada.
Muito obrigado. Muchas gracias. Thanks a lot. I apologize for clapping. It's just that the audience cannot. Again, thank you, Gemma Puixeu, for putting this amazing talk together that puts so much important information in such short amount of time, and however, it's still so clear. Thank you so much. This is an amazing contribution. Before we go to questions and answers, I would like our audience to know that our next talk will be in another room. It's going to be by Rocio de Ana, and I am giving you all the information for the talk here on the link. If you would like to go there next, that talk starts at 3:55. Now, we already have some questions. The first question I have is from Manolo, and he's saying, awesome talk, Gemma. What is the role of scientific communication to spread important results like yours? And how can we improve our ways to spread them?
Yeah, that's the key, no? I think, as I mentioned at the beginning, and as we saw throughout the talk, and and probably throughout many talks during the conference, how we communicate things really matters a lot, and how we look at the data and what to do out of them. Actually, science is a political thing to do. And even me, that I'm committed to looking at things from a different angle, I also have a political agenda behind me. And it's important to acknowledge that when we're communicating our research. My research will never, I will never state my research without stating my purposes beforehand. And I think we all should do this to some extent, because it's very important to know that all of this is not objective, all of this is not completely unbiased. And I think communicating that science per se works this way is super important. Yes.
Thank you for that. I would like to echo some of our audience's commentary, which are not questions, but are worthwhile to be mentioned. Inês Gonçalves says, amazing talk, thank you. Cecilia Silva, amazing. Nathalie Spanguerrero, I'm sorry if I'm butchering people's names. She says, thank you, Gemma. Lucia Fernandes Goya, this was an amazing talk. And now, Andrea Catalina Pinzon Achuri, essa foi tremenda charla, dá uma perspectiva diferente. Gracias. Mariana Guilhardi, thank you for your amazing talk, Gemma. What would you say that could be approached to tackle what is gender, the question, what is gender? So how do we, based on your research and your experience, how do we recommend, or what could you say about approaching this question about what is gender?
I think that's the key question, no? Trying to tell both apart. I understand what the question is, how can we say how much is cultural, no? Like gender understood as a cultural component. I think since I'm more focused on the what is sex part, maybe I can answer that more specifically. I think it's very difficult to design such experiments, but I think in the ideal world, what one would do is start with the null hypothesis that all of the observed differences are due to cultural elements, and then to try to prove otherwise. No, try to prove somehow that culture is not enough to explain the results that you see, and try to design the experiments in a way that tell you that no, biology has had something to do with that. And this is super difficult, but that's the type of approach that we need to start applying if we really want to understand what sex and gender are.
Thank you. That was an amazing answer. Maria Eduarda de Andrade Borges says, thanks for the wonderful talk, Gemma. Super important discussion topic. And Gabriele Weber, again, I apologize if I'm butchering people's names. Thank you for your awesome presentation. Is it really important to close the gap between biological and societal vectors in the relation between sex and gender?
I think this was not a question because I'm reading it simultaneously. I think it's a statement.
It's not a question. I try to read it as one. And
yeah. And
Gabrielle, maybe we will read it as an assertment. Yeah, you are correct. Thank you. If I don't see any other questions here, but I have some that my colleagues from the organization sent to us, which I will read while we wait for more questions from the audience. First, how, from our areas of evolution, systematics and biogeography, could we recognize diversity from the content of our courses, especially in the courses where women are less represented?
Oh, a completely different topic, how to increase diversity. Start with increasing representation, start with encouraging, in this case, women or non-male people to engage in particular fields, talk about this, increase visibility. We cannot insist on this enough. We won't reach equality unless we visualize all of these problematics. So that's a very important point. I think there are many strategies in place to do these things, and I think this is out of the scope of this talk, but we can discuss this offline. Like if you message me or if you email me, it's written here on the slides, or via Discord channel, we can also keep talking.
Thank you. And I would like to remember the audience that you can also access information about Gemma Puixeu's biography, her work, and her contact information through our website, sbemeeting.com. Moving on with questions from the audience. Let me see if I don't miss anything. I think the next one will be Aileen Contreras. Gracias, Gemma, por toda esta valiosa información. Diego F. Alvarado Serrano says, super interesting talk. Do you know of any evidence of similar research on other species? And if so, are there any parallelisms?
I think that's another problem, that we are only acknowledging gender in humans, no? And I think the rest is completely biological. I mean, partially we are trying to tell apart different components. So the contribution of different biological components in different studies. So for example, there's a mouse model where there's a mixture of hormonal composition and chromosomal composition. So for example, XY individuals that have female hormones and vice versa. So there we can tell apart a bit the chromosomal and hormonal component and so on. But talking about gender in mouse is a bit hard, no? So I'm not sure, but I think these are all like, we should start thinking about that, like expanding the vision of this biological determinism that we have, that everything has to be biology, and try to look at the context too, which is probably true for also many other species.
Thank you. Melania Andrea Vega Angeles says, excelente charla. Me parece relevante abordar el tema sexo-género, incluindo la biología y lo social, que a veces parecen estar tan alejadas. Gracias, Gemma, por compartir los sitios donde podemos ver más sobre tu trabajo. Me ayudaría mucho al dar clases de biología. Los jóvenes suelen preguntarme sobre cómo se entiende el sexo y el género desde la biología. Gracias. Luísa, muito obrigada por levantar estas questões super pertinentes a serem consideradas sempre. Muito boa palestra. Diego F. Alvarado Serrano. In particular, I'm interested in this idea of a cross-species comparison because I think it could shed light on how much research biases / agenda have clouded this question. I agree. Sarai Anaya says, muy interesante, super. And Diego F. Alvarado Serrano again says, not gender per se, but roles, for example, parental roles. Very good point. One question from the organization committee. Do you think that, based on what we discussed so far, is there a need for us to reevaluate to think in a reevaluation of biological evidence for gender inequality?
Definitely.
So do you need me to reread that? Because I did not do a good job.
I think I understood.
Got it.
And definitely, that's another point which I like to talk about too when I do this type of contributions. And I think gender inequality is another fundamental point where we have been really good at providing biological evidence for, and that's also completely unjustified. And this has much more to do with the evolutionary community, the evolutionary biology community. No, these Darwinian ideas that some traits, some very valuable traits, appeared because men compete with each other actively, while female basically only absorb them passively from men. No, and therefore men are the ones that lead the course of evolution, and they are the most important sex. And that's completely untrue. That's completely untrue, and that's the thing that we think, that we read and hear all the time. Or also, for example, that the sperm has an active role in fecundation, while the egg lays there waiting for the sperm to save them, like the mistress needing to be saved in the tower. Like all of these are cultural elements overlapping with our biology, and this is all wrong. We should re-question all of that, and we have all heard a lot about this in our biology class at the elementary school.
Thank you so much for that. I would like to remind our audience that the talk by Rocio Deana has started. The link is on the chat. I also provided some links that I received from Gemma and people that organized this talk with her. And if you want to learn more about our speakers, please go to sbemeeting.com/speakers. I don't see any other questions from the audience, so I would like to close down by thank you, Gemma Puixeu, again for coming here. I know it's hard times for everyone, and I cannot stress how much we appreciate all the organization for you to making the effort of putting this very valuable talk together. Before we go, do you want to say something else?
No, just thanks. I'm happy you found this interesting, and I would be really happy if you got in touch to discuss more. I think we are really isolated these days, so please do get in touch.
Thank you for being so reachable. Thank you, the audience. And I would like now to ask our colleagues at UNC Charlotte to please close the room. And thank you. Thank you all.